There are visions that frighten a person because they reveal monsters. There are visions that frighten a person because they reveal death. And then there are visions that frighten a person because they reveal what humanity becomes when mercy disappears. Enoch had already seen things that should have been impossible for mortal eyes. He had been lifted beyond the familiar boundaries of earth. He had been shown heavenly places that stretched beyond the imagination of ordinary men. He had witnessed beings whose appearance belonged to another order of creation, places whose architecture seemed to have been constructed according to laws invisible to human understanding, and mysteries that made the greatest kingdoms of earth appear small. But nothing had prepared him for the place toward which his guides were now carrying him. They were taking him north, and the farther they went, the more Enoch felt that something was wrong. There was no announcement, no trumpet, no great celestial voice warning him of what was ahead. His guides simply continued. They moved with the certainty of beings who already knew the destination. Enoch followed because he had learned that when heaven reveals a mystery, the first answer is often silence. But this silence was different. It was heavy. It seemed to surround him. The world gradually lost its familiar character. The landscapes he had known vanished. The ordinary signs of life disappeared. No fields, no villages, no trees bending beneath the wind, no birds crossing the sky, no distant sound of human activity. The farther north they traveled, the more Enoch felt as though he was leaving behind not merely a region of earth, but an entire category of existence. He looked toward his guides. They did not explain. So Enoch continued. Then the light began to disappear. At first it was subtle. The brightness simply seemed weaker. Then the horizon itself became indistinct. Then Enoch realized that he could no longer tell where the ground ended and the darkness began. He had known darkness before. Every mortal knows darkness. A man enters a room after sunset and waits for his eyes to adjust. A traveler crosses the wilderness beneath a moonless sky. A shepherd stands beneath clouds that conceal the stars. But this was not ordinary darkness. This darkness did not merely hide things. It seemed to possess the place. There was no sense that morning would eventually come. No suggestion that somewhere beyond the horizon the sun continued its course. No promise of dawn. The darkness was absolute. And then Enoch saw something burning inside it. He stopped. For a moment, he could not understand what he was looking at. There was fire, but it was unlike any fire he had ever seen. It did not behave like the flames of a hearth. It did not illuminate the surrounding world. Instead, the flames seemed almost black, a black fire. It rose continuously from the darkness, perpetually, without exhaustion, without consuming whatever fed it, without diminishing. Enoch stared. The sight should have produced light. Fire should drive darkness away. Yet here the opposite seemed to happen. The black flame made the darkness more frightening. It was as if the fire had been stripped of everything comforting about fire. There was no warmth, no gathering around a hearth, no glow upon a loved one's face, no smoke rising from a peaceful home, only burning, only darkness, only judgment. And then Enoch saw the river, a river of fire. It came from somewhere beyond the prison, flowing across the land with an unstoppable motion. Enoch watched it wind through the darkness. The flames rolled upon themselves. They moved like liquid, a river made not of water, but of burning judgment. And still, strangely, the place was cold. Enoch looked toward another part of the landscape. There was ice, freezing darkness. The ancient vision described something almost impossible. Fire and freezing cold existing together. One place burns, another freezes. The fire dries, the cold freezes. And somehow both exist without canceling each other. Enoch's mind struggled to contain what he was seeing. How could flame exist beside ice? How could burning heat coexist with freezing darkness? Why would a place prepared for punishment contain opposites rather than one single instrument of suffering? Perhaps that was the point. The prison did not obey the comfortable rules of the world Enoch knew. It was not a place where one could adapt. There would be no simple strategy for survival. In the desert, a person searches for shade. In the cold, a person searches for fire. But what happens when fire and cold become equally terrifying? Where does a person flee? Enoch had no answer. Then he noticed the structures. At first they seemed like shadows, dark shapes rising from the landscape. But as his eyes adjusted, he realized they were places of detention, cells, enclosures, prisons within the prison. Some appeared to disappear into the darkness. Others seemed sealed, and from somewhere within them came sounds, not the sounds of a living city, not voices speaking peacefully. These were cries, distant, broken, sometimes almost impossible to distinguish from the wind. Enoch stopped again. His guides continued. He looked at them. They showed no fear. That frightened him more. The beings accompanying him had seen this place before. They knew what lived within it. They knew what happened here, and yet they moved through the darkness with the calm certainty of servants carrying out an appointed task. Enoch began to understand that this was not chaos. This place had order, terrible order. The prison had been prepared. The darkness had a purpose. The fire had a purpose. The ice had a purpose. The cells had a purpose. And somewhere ahead were the beings responsible for carrying out the punishment. Enoch heard them before he saw them. A scraping sound, metal against stone, then another. A chain moving, then footsteps. Slow, heavy, measured. Enoch turned toward the sound. Something emerged from the darkness. An angel. But not an angel as Enoch might have imagined one standing in the presence of God. This being was associated with judgment. The ancient description speaks of dark and merciless angels. They carried instruments of torment. There was no softness in their appearance, no suggestion that they had come to comfort anyone. They were guardians of the prison, agents of punishment. Enoch's heart trembled. He had seen heavenly beings before. He knew that angels could be terrifying even when they brought messages of mercy. But these beings were different. Their purpose was not to reassure. Their purpose was to enforce judgment. And Enoch suddenly understood that the most terrifying thing in this place was not the fire. It was not the ice. It was not even the darkness. It was the certainty behind everything. Nothing here was accidental. Nothing here had happened by chance. This was a place prepared for those who had rejected the order of the Creator. Enoch finally spoke. Woe, woe. His words escaped him before he could restrain them. He looked across the terrible landscape. How very frightful this place is. The guides answered, and their explanation transformed the entire vision. This place, they told him, had been prepared for those who did not glorify God. But then came the list, and it was longer than Enoch expected. There were those who practiced what the ancient text describes as sin against nature. There were those involved in witchcraft, enchantments, divinations, trafficking with demons, those who did not merely commit evil but boasted about it, people who celebrated what should have caused shame, people who turned wrongdoing into an identity. But then the list changed. Stealing, lying, insulting, coveting, resentment, fornication, murder. Enoch listened. The supernatural sins were frightening, but these were different. These were familiar. He had seen thieves before. He had heard lies. He had witnessed anger. He knew what envy could do to a household. He knew how resentment could poison relationships. He knew that murder was not a story belonging only to ancient monsters. Human beings could kill other human beings. And now the vision was telling him that these seemingly ordinary acts belonged in the same moral landscape. The prison was not reserved only for people who practiced forbidden mysteries. It also contained people who simply refused to live with mercy, truth, and restraint. Enoch looked again at the prisoners. The realization began to settle over him. The greatest horror was not that evil existed somewhere far away. The greatest horror was that the seeds of the prison could exist in ordinary human choices. A lie could be small. A theft could be small. An insult could be spoken in a moment of anger. Covetousness could begin as a thought. Resentment could grow quietly. A person might not recognize where the road was leading, but the vision suggested that repeated choices could eventually become a direction, and directions lead somewhere. The guides moved farther into the prison. Then they showed Enoch, another group. These were people who had stolen the souls of human beings secretly. The language is strange and frightening. What does it mean to steal a soul? The ancient text immediately gives the imagery that explains it. These were people who seized the poor by the throat, people who took away possessions, people who enriched themselves through what belonged to others, people who defrauded. The metaphor becomes physical. A hand around a throat, a person unable to breathe, a victim unable to resist. The powerful taking from the powerless. Enoch looked upon the scene and realized that this prison was not concerned only with what people did to God. It was concerned with what they did to one another. That distinction mattered because a person could claim to worship heaven while destroying someone on earth. A person could perform rituals while exploiting the vulnerable. A person could speak holy words while feeding upon the desperation of others. The vision would not permit such contradictions to remain hidden. The Creator, whom people claimed to worship, was also the creator of the people they oppressed. And therefore, the treatment of the vulnerable became a spiritual question. The guides showed Enoch the hungry. This sight wounded him differently. The ancient passage describes people who possessed the ability to provide sustenance. They could feed, they had food, they had resources, yet they allowed the hungry to die. Enoch stared. He understood hunger. Every mortal understands hunger. A child cries because there is no food. A mother searches through an empty storehouse. A traveler reaches the end of his provisions. A worker becomes weak because he has not eaten. Hunger is physical, but deliberate starvation is something else. The guide's words made the distinction clear. These people could have provided sustenance. They chose not to. The horror was not simply that someone died hungry. It was that someone possessed the power to prevent the death and refused. Enoch looked across the darkness. The river of fire continued flowing. The black flames continued rising. The prisoners remained trapped. And suddenly, the fire seemed less frightening than the moral reality behind it. What kind of person sees another human being starving and decides that the suffering is acceptable? What happens inside a human heart when another person's life becomes less important than one's own possessions? Enoch could not answer. Then came another scene, the naked. People without clothing, people exposed to the elements. And again, the guides explained, there were those who possessed clothing but took away the final garment of the naked. Enoch looked at the freezing darkness surrounding him. Now the image became almost unbearable. The place itself was cold. The prisoners were exposed, and the guides had just told him that some of the condemned had once stripped vulnerable people of the protection they needed to survive. The connection was impossible to ignore. On Earth, someone had taken away another person's covering. Here, the condemned encountered a realm where no comfort remained. The vision had become a terrible mirror. Those who withheld mercy encountered a place without mercy. Those who stripped others encountered nakedness. Those who allowed hunger to destroy others encountered a prison where suffering had no easy escape. Those who seized possessions discovered that possessions could not save them. And those who had enriched themselves from the misery of others discovered that wealth had no currency in the realm of judgment. Enoch began to see something even deeper. The prison was not simply about punishment. It was about the exposure of false values. On Earth, possessions appear powerful. Here, they are meaningless. On Earth, status can intimidate. Here, status is gone. On Earth, a wealthy person can surround himself with walls. Here, walls imprison. On Earth, a powerful person can command servants. Here, the only beings who command are the angels of judgment. On Earth, a liar can manipulate a story. Here, there is nowhere to hide the truth. The northern prison stripped away the illusions that human beings build around themselves. And perhaps that was why Enoch found it so terrifying. The prisoners were no longer able to pretend. No wealth, no titles, no reputation, no excuses, no audience to impress. Only the truth of what they had become. Then the guide showed him another category. Those who refused to acknowledge the Creator. Instead, they bowed before idols, images made by human hands. Enoch looked upon them. The irony was terrible. A person could take wood or stone, shape it, carve it, polish it, decorate it, then kneel before it. But the object could not see, could not hear, could not speak, could not save. It was a thing created by the worshiper. Yet the worshiper surrendered himself to it. The ancient text calls these idols vain gods, empty, lifeless, powerless. Enoch understood that the issue was larger than statues. A human being can make many things into objects of worship. Wealth, power, pleasure, fame, possession, knowledge, even the human ego itself. Anything created can become an idol when it takes the place of the Creator. And perhaps this was the thread connecting the entire vision. The thief worships possession. The greedy person worships wealth. The violent person worships power. The liar worships self-preservation. The oppressor worships control. The sorcerer seeks forbidden power. The idolater bows before something made by human hands. Different actions, different appearances, but one underlying movement. The creature turning away from the Creator and placing something else at the center. Enoch looked back toward the black fire. He had entered the northern region expecting perhaps to witness punishment. Instead, he was being shown the anatomy of corruption, how a human being could begin with desire, how desire could become greed, how greed could become exploitation, how exploitation could become cruelty, how cruelty could become indifference, how indifference could allow another person to die, and how at the end of that road, the human heart could become so hardened that it no longer recognized the Creator or the sacredness of another human life. The prison suddenly seemed larger, not geographically, morally. It contained the end of every path that rejected mercy. Enoch looked at his guides. They had shown him enough to understand the lesson, but Enoch had not yet seen everything. The angels still moved through the darkness. The river of fire still flowed. The prisoners remained. And beyond the next shadow waited the deepest question of the entire vision. If these people had known where their choices were leading, would they have turned around? Enoch did not know. But the fact that he had been brought here suggested that the living still had something the prisoners no longer possessed. Something precious. Something the fire could not restore. Something the angels could not return. Time. Time to choose. Time to repent. Time to feed the hungry. Time to clothe the naked. Time to return what had been stolen. Time to abandon lies. Time to stop violence. Time to turn away from forbidden practices. Time to stop worshiping the things made by human hands. Time to acknowledge the Creator. Enoch stood in the darkness. The black flames rose. The river burned. The ice remained. And suddenly the terrible place became something more than a prison. It became a warning given before the end. A warning delivered to a living man, so that living people might hear it. Enoch had not yet returned, but now he understood why he had been allowed to see. He was not merely being shown the fate of the wicked. He was being shown the road that leads there. And the road did not begin with the gates of the prison. It began much earlier, with the first lie, the first theft, the first act of cruelty, the first moment when another person's hunger became inconvenient, the first time power was used to crush instead of protect, the first time a person decided that possessions mattered more than people, the first time the Creator was forgotten. Enoch looked into the darkness, and the darkness seemed to look back. The journey north had only begun. Enoch had seen the prison. Now he was going to meet its guardians. At first, he heard them. That was how they announced themselves. Not with thunder, not with the blast of celestial trumpets, not with voices descending from the heavens. The first sound was almost too faint to notice. A scrape. Then silence. Another scrape. Then the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged across stone. Enoch turned toward the darkness. His guides had stopped. For the first time since entering the northern region, they were no longer moving forward. Enoch stared into the blackness ahead. Nothing. Then came another sound. Metal striking stone. A slow, deliberate rhythm. Clang. Silence. Clang. Silence. The sound seemed to travel through the entire prison. Enoch felt something inside him tighten. He had already witnessed the river of fire. He had seen the freezing darkness. He had seen the terrible places of detention. He had heard the distant cries of those imprisoned there. But now he understood something he had not fully considered. A prison needs guardians. And whatever guarded this place was approaching. Enoch looked at the men who had brought him. They did not retreat. They did not warn him. They simply waited. Then something moved inside the darkness. A silhouette appeared. At first, Enoch could make out only its shape. Tall, still, unnaturally still. Then it stepped forward. The first angel emerged. Enoch knew immediately that this was not a messenger of the kind he had encountered elsewhere. This being belonged to the prison. Its presence seemed to merge with the darkness around it. The ancient description speaks of dark and merciless angels. That phrase would remain with Enoch. Dark. Merciless. Not because the beings were independent demons ruling a kingdom of their own, but because their appointed task was terrible. They were instruments of judgment. They did not come to negotiate. They did not come to comfort. They did not come to ask the prisoners whether they regretted their actions. They carried out the sentence, and in their hands were instruments of punishment. Enoch stared at those instruments. He could not understand how such things could exist in a realm governed by heavenly order. The instruments were designed for suffering. Some appeared like tools of restraint, others like implements made specifically to inflict pain. Every object seemed to communicate the same message. There would be no escape, no negotiation, no cleverness, no hiding place. The angels moved through the prison as though they had performed these duties countless times. And Enoch suddenly realized that the most frightening thing about them was not rage. They did not appear furious. They did not scream. They did not boast. They simply performed their appointed work. There was something almost unbearable about that calmness. Human beings often imagine judgment as a moment of uncontrolled anger. But this vision presented something colder: order. The sentence had been determined. The prison had been prepared. The angels had their duties. The condemned had no authority over any of it. Enoch whispered, "Who are they?" One of his guides answered, "They are appointed to this place." That was all. Enoch looked again. The angel passed between two chambers. A prisoner cried out. The angel did not stop. Another voice pleaded. The angel continued. Someone shouted that he had once been powerful. Someone else called for wealth. Another demanded to be released. The angels ignored them all, and Enoch understood why. Those voices belonged to people who were accustomed to being heard. Perhaps some had been rulers, some merchants, some landowners, some men whose wealth had purchased obedience, some who had commanded servants, some who had been feared in their communities. But the northern prison did not recognize earthly rank. The rich man was no longer rich. The influential man was no longer influential. The oppressor could no longer intimidate. The thief could no longer hide. The liar could no longer manipulate. The powerful had entered a realm where power belonged to someone else. And that realization frightened Enoch more than the instruments, because he began to understand that judgment reverses the illusions of earthly life. On earth, a man may appear untouchable. He may have guards. He may have walls. He may have servants. He may possess weapons. He may own land. He may control others. He may be able to silence a poor man's complaint simply by refusing to listen. But before the judgment of heaven, those protections disappear. The prison has no privileged entrance. There is no special chamber reserved for the wealthy. No hidden door for the influential. No bribe that can be passed secretly to an angel. No political connection that can open the gates. The instruments of earthly power have become meaningless. Enoch watched a prisoner reach toward an angel. The prisoner seemed desperate. The angel continued walking. The man called again. Nothing. The angel's silence was devastating. Enoch had seen human beings ignore suffering before, but here the silence had become absolute. The angels were not there to rescue. They were there to execute judgment. And then Enoch remembered the people the guides had shown him earlier. The poor, the hungry, the naked, the cheated, the robbed. The victims whose possessions had been taken by those stronger than themselves. The people who had been treated as though their lives were worth less than money. Enoch suddenly understood the relationship. Those who had refused to hear the cries of others were now trapped in a place where their own cries could not alter the sentence. The reversal was terrifying. The person who had once said, "I do not care that you are hungry," now discovered that hunger could not be escaped. The person who had stripped another human being of clothing now found himself in a place where comfort was absent. The person who had stolen from the helpless now had nothing that could be used to purchase freedom. The person who had exploited another's weakness now stood completely powerless. It was not simply punishment, it was exposure. The prison revealed the truth about people after every earthly disguise had been removed. And Enoch wondered whether that was why the place was so dark. Perhaps darkness represented more than the absence of light. Perhaps it was the absence of every illusion. In ordinary life, people can hide behind appearances. A cruel man can appear respectable. A thief can appear generous. A liar can appear trustworthy. An oppressor can appear successful. A corrupt person can appear religious. A person who has built wealth from another's suffering can appear blessed. But the northern prison contains no audience to deceive. There is only truth, and the truth is merciless. Enoch looked toward another section of the prison. There were people there who had been involved in occult practices. The ancient passage speaks of witchcraft, enchantments, divination, and trafficking with demons. To Enoch, these practices represented another form of rebellion. The people had not been content to live within the order given to humanity. They sought hidden power, secret knowledge, forbidden access, influence beyond ordinary human limits. Perhaps some had wanted to know the future. Others wanted power over enemies. Others wanted wealth. Others wanted control over people. Whatever their motives, the vision presents them as people who sought power through forbidden means. And now they had discovered the ultimate irony. They had sought supernatural power, but in the prison, they possessed none. They had sought hidden knowledge, but there was nothing they could discover that would change the sentence. They had sought control, but they could not control even their own circumstances. They had attempted to command unseen forces. Now unseen forces commanded them. Enoch shuddered. Then came another group. These were the ones who had boasted about their evil deeds. That detail disturbed him. There was something especially dark about boasting. A person may commit a wrong and later feel shame. A person may recognize what he has done and seek forgiveness. But boasting transforms the relationship with evil. The wrongdoing becomes an achievement. The victim becomes a trophy. The sin becomes a source of pride. Enoch looked at the condemned. Some seemed to have carried their pride with them. Even here, they remembered what they had done. They spoke about their exploits. And they spoke about wealth they had accumulated. People they had deceived. People they had defeated. People they had humiliated. People they had destroyed on earth. Perhaps they had laughed while telling these stories. Perhaps others had admired them. Perhaps cruelty had made them seem strong. But in this place, the meaning had changed. There was no applause, no admiration, no audience impressed by brutality. The stories had become evidence. Every boast had become a testimony against its speaker. Enoch realized that the prison contained another terrifying reversal. On earth, evil can sometimes produce status. A ruthless person can rise. A dishonest person can become wealthy. A manipulator can become influential. A violent person can become feared. People may even praise such individuals, but the ancient vision strips away that distortion. Here, the achievement is no longer measured by what the person gained. It is measured by what the person destroyed. And Enoch began to understand why the guides had listed such seemingly ordinary acts: stealing, lying, insulting, coveting, resentment, fornication, murder. The list was not random. Each one represented a different way of turning away from the dignity of another human being. The thief says, "What belongs to you can become mine." The liar says, "Your right to truth does not matter." The insulter says, "Your dignity can be attacked for my pleasure." The covetous person says, "What you possess should belong to me." The resentful person says, "Your blessing is an offense against me." The murderer says, "Your life can be taken." And the exploiter says, "Your weakness exists for my advantage." The northern prison gathers these attitudes together. They are different expressions of the same disease. The self becomes supreme. Other people become secondary, and eventually even God becomes irrelevant. Enoch's guides continued. They brought him toward another chamber. There he saw something that disturbed him even more deeply. A man had once possessed great resources: food, land, clothing, storage. Enough to sustain many people, yet around him had been others who were starving. The ancient vision condemns the man not simply because he was wealthy. His possessions were not presented as the crime. The crime was what he did with them. He could provide sustenance. He chose not to. Enoch looked at him. The man seemed to remember the people who had once begged him for help. One had asked for bread. Another had asked for grain. Another had asked for a garment. Perhaps they had offered labor. Perhaps they had pleaded. Perhaps they had fallen at his feet, but he had refused. And now he stood in the prison. The wealth was gone. The stored grain was gone. The houses were gone. The servants were gone. The earthly abundance that had seemed permanent had disappeared. Only the moral reality remained. Enoch's heart tightened. He understood something that would have been easy to miss. The ancient vision was not saying that every rich person is condemned. It was saying something much more disturbing. Possession creates responsibility. If a person has enough to save another and deliberately chooses not to, the possession itself becomes part of the moral question. Food can be a blessing, but it can also become a weapon when withheld from the starving. Clothing can protect, but it can become an instrument of cruelty when deliberately taken from the naked. Money can build, but it can also destroy when obtained through exploitation. Power can defend, but it can also crush. The same object can become either an instrument of mercy or an instrument of oppression. The difference is the heart of the person holding it. Then Enoch saw the naked. He had already heard about them. Now he witnessed their suffering. People who had once possessed clothing had taken away the last garment of those who had little. Enoch looked toward the frozen region of the prison. The connection was terrifying. Cold, exposure, vulnerability. The guides had deliberately shown him this. A person who has never been cold may not understand the desperation of someone without shelter. A person surrounded by abundance may not understand hunger. A person clothed in comfort may forget what it means to possess nothing. But the prison made suffering impossible to ignore. The condemned could no longer turn away. The very conditions of the prison became a testimony, and Enoch wondered whether this was part of divine judgment, not merely pain, but understanding. The people who had refused to understand the suffering of others were placed in a world where suffering became impossible to ignore. The thought frightened him, because human beings are capable of becoming remarkably skilled at looking away. They can walk past hunger. They can ignore poverty. They can dismiss the wounded. They can convince themselves that another person's suffering is deserved. They can say, "It is not my responsibility. They should have worked harder. They made their own choices. I cannot help everyone." Sometimes those statements may contain partial truths, but the vision is aimed at something more deliberate. What happens when a person has the means to help and chooses exploitation instead? What happens when compassion becomes inconvenient? What happens when wealth becomes more important than life? Enoch stared into the prison, and the answer was all around him. Then the angels moved again. Their instruments made that terrible sound against the stone. Clang, scrape, clang. Enoch followed. He saw another chamber, then another. The prison seemed endless. Every corridor revealed another form of corruption. Every door seemed to contain another warning. And gradually Enoch realized that the angels did not need to invent new forms of punishment. The lives of the condemned had already supplied the logic. The prison was filled with consequences. A person had chosen violence. Now, violence surrounded him. A person had chosen deception. Now, there was no deception capable of saving him. A person had chosen greed. Now, greed could offer nothing. A person had chosen power. Now, power belonged entirely to the judgment. A person had chosen forbidden knowledge. Now, knowledge could not provide an escape. A person had worshipped idols. Now the idols were silent. And that silence became one of the most disturbing elements of the entire vision. Enoch remembered the images made by human hands. The ancient passage emphasizes their inability to see or hear. That was the irony. The worshiper had given devotion to something that could not respond. The idol could not hear prayer, could not defend its worshiper, could not speak, could not save. Yet the person had trusted it. Now, in the prison, those false gods were absent. There was no statue to pray to, no carved image to carry, no human-made deity to bargain with. Only the Creator's judgment remained. Enoch looked at one of the condemned idolaters. The person seemed to search for something. A statue, an image, a symbol, anything. But there was nothing. The things that had once seemed sacred were powerless. And Enoch understood idolatry was not simply about kneeling before stone. It was about transferring trust. A human being created to depend upon the Creator could instead surrender himself to something created. The object might be wealth. It might be power. It might be pleasure. It might be an image. It might even be the human self. But eventually the created thing cannot provide what the Creator provides. It cannot give life. It cannot defeat death. It cannot erase guilt. It cannot rescue a person from judgment. The prison revealed that reality. Enoch looked toward the angels again. They remained silent. That silence disturbed him. He expected anger. He expected shouting. He expected some visible expression of hatred. Instead, the angels seemed almost mechanical in their obedience. They did not torture because they hated the prisoners. They were carrying out judgment. And this distinction mattered. The ancient vision does not present the angels as rulers of an evil kingdom. They are servants within a larger divine order. The darkness is not their kingdom. The prison is not their invention. The punishment is not their personal revenge. They are instruments. That made them more frightening, because it meant the prison could not be negotiated with. Enoch could not persuade an angel to change the rules. He could not offer an argument. He could not appeal to sympathy. The angels were not judges deciding cases. The sentence had already been established. They were carrying it out. Enoch suddenly thought of the living. He thought of people who believed judgment was only a distant possibility. People who laughed at warnings. People who thought consequences could always be postponed. People who believed that wealth could protect them. People who believed that influence could erase wrongdoing. People who believed that secrets could remain secret forever. If they could see this place, would they continue? Would the thief continue stealing? Would the liar continue lying? Would the exploiter continue exploiting? Would the person with food continue watching the hungry die? Would the person with clothing continue stripping the naked? Would the powerful continue crushing the powerless? Enoch did not know, but now he understood why he had been shown the prison. The vision was not given to the dead. It was being shown to the living, and that changed everything. The fire was a warning. The ice was a warning. The angels were a warning. The darkness was a warning. The prison itself was a warning, because Enoch could still leave. The condemned could not. He still possessed time. They did not. He could still speak. They could only cry. He could still choose. Their choices had become history. Enoch felt a strange grief. The terror of the prison was undeniable, but beneath the terror was something else. Tragedy. These people had once lived beneath the same sky as everyone else. They had woken in the morning. They had eaten. They had spoken with friends. They had walked among families. They had possessed opportunities. They had encountered people who needed help. They had been given chances to choose truth. And somewhere along the road, they had chosen differently. Again and again and again, until the choices became habits. The habits became character, and the character eventually became destiny. Enoch looked toward the black flames. He understood now that the prison had not appeared suddenly in their lives. The prison was the end of a road, and the road began in the heart. A small act of dishonesty, a small act of cruelty, a small surrender to greed, a moment of hatred, a refusal to help, a decision to exploit, a willingness to treat another person as less than human. One act becomes another. Another becomes easier. Then the conscience grows quieter. Eventually, the person no longer feels the weight of what he is doing. And that may be the most terrible punishment of all. To become so accustomed to darkness that light begins to feel like an enemy. Enoch stood motionless. One of the angels passed close to him. The being's presence was overwhelming. Enoch felt the instinct to flee, but his guides remained beside him. The angel continued. No word, no explanation. Only the sound of its instruments moving through the darkness. And Enoch realized that the angel did not need to speak. The prison itself was speaking. The fire said, "Your actions matter." The ice said, "The suffering you ignored mattered." The chains said, "You are not beyond accountability." The darkness said, "What is hidden from human eyes is not necessarily hidden forever." And the angel said nothing because the sentence had already been spoken. Enoch finally turned away, but the guides were not finished. There was one more section they wanted him to see. One more category. One more revelation. Enoch looked toward the darkness ahead. The black fire rose higher. The river of flame roared. The frozen region stretched into the distance. The angels continued their work, and somewhere beyond them waited the final lesson. The ancient vision had shown Enoch what happens when people worship false gods, practice forbidden arts, commit violence, steal, lie, covet, exploit, and abandon the vulnerable. But now Enoch was about to understand the deepest principle connecting all of these sins. The problem was not simply that people had broken rules. It was that they had rejected the order of love, truth, and recognition of the Creator. They had taken what was not theirs. They had harmed those who could not defend themselves. They had withheld what could have preserved life. They had worshipped what their own hands had made. They had placed desire above obedience. They had placed wealth above mercy. They had placed power above justice. And when all those choices were gathered together, The result was a world turned upside down. A world where the strong consume the weak. A world where the rich ignore the hungry. A world where the naked are stripped further. A world where lies replace truth. A world where violence becomes entertainment. A world where forbidden power becomes more attractive than wisdom. A world where created things receive the worship that belongs to the Creator. The prison was the final picture of that disorder. Enoch understood the angels were not the beginning of the story. They were the end. The real story began long before the prisoners arrived. It began when they were still free. It began when they could still turn around. Enoch looked back toward the direction from which he had come. Somewhere beyond the northern darkness was the world of the living. Somewhere the sun was still shining. Somewhere children were still eating. Somewhere the naked still needed clothing. Somewhere the poor were still being exploited. Somewhere people were still lying. Somewhere thieves were still stealing. Somewhere murderers were still planning. Somewhere idolaters were still bowing. Somewhere men and women were still believing that no one could see what happened in secret. And suddenly Enoch wanted desperately to return, not because he was afraid for himself, because he had seen what happened when people refused to change. He had seen the destination. He had walked through the prison. He had seen the fire. He had felt the cold. He had heard the chains. He had witnessed the angels. And now he carried something more dangerous than fear. He carried a warning. The northern prison had shown him the final destination, but there was still a road between the living world and that terrible place. And that road was made of choices. Enoch's guides turned toward him. It was time to continue. The angels disappeared behind the darkness. The sound of their instruments became distant. The river of fire remained. The black flames continued burning. But Enoch was no longer looking at the prison in the same way. He had begun to understand its true terror. It was not simply a place where evil people were punished. It was a place where every excuse finally died. Every lie, every disguise, every false identity, every illusion of power, everything that a person had used to avoid responsibility, gone. What remained was the truth. And Enoch was about to be shown exactly what that truth meant. He was about to witness the final reversal. The powerful would become powerless. The wealthy would discover the poverty of possessing nothing. The exploiters would lose everything they had stolen. The idolaters would discover that their gods were silent. And those who had refused mercy would enter a place where mercy was no longer being offered.
I beg you.
The angelic guardians continued their silent work.
Please, no.
The prison waited. But Enoch was leaving one day. The condemned would not. And as his guides led him deeper into the darkness, Enoch understood the question that would haunt him when he returned to the world of sunlight. What will a human being do with the time he still has? The angels disappeared into the darkness, but their silence remained. Enoch stood motionless, listening to the sounds of the prison. The river of fire continued to flow. Somewhere in the distance, black flames rose without end. The frozen region stretched beyond what his eyes could comprehend. And behind the walls of the terrible detention places, the cries continued. But something had changed. Enoch was no longer looking only at the punishment. He was beginning to understand the crime. That was worse. The fire was terrible. The ice was terrible. The angels were terrible. But none of them frightened him as much as the realization that the people suffering in this place had once possessed something the prisoners no longer had: choice. They had lived beneath ordinary skies. They had possessed food, clothing, homes, possessions, influence, strength, opportunities. They had encountered people weaker than themselves. And every time they encountered weakness, they had been given a choice: protect or exploit, give or take, feed or starve, clothe or strip away, tell the truth or lie, show mercy or crush. Enoch looked into the darkness, and now he understood why the guides had brought him here. The northern region was not merely a place of punishment. It was a revelation of what happens when strength becomes separated from mercy. The strong against the weak, the rich against the poor, the powerful against the defenseless, the person with food against the person who is starving, the person with clothing against the person exposed to the cold, the person with possessions against the person who has already lost everything, the person with a voice against the person nobody will hear. Enoch had seen the fire. Now he was about to see the victims. And the first thing he noticed was the silence. Not the complete silence of the prison. Something else. The silence of people who had learned that crying did not necessarily bring help. Enoch looked toward one of the detention places. A figure sat inside. The person seemed exhausted. The body was thin. The posture was defeated. There was no anger left, only weariness. Enoch moved closer. His guides did not stop him. He looked at the prisoner, and suddenly, without anyone explaining it, Enoch understood. The person had known hunger, not the brief hunger that comes when a meal is delayed, not the discomfort of an empty stomach before supper. This was something deeper, hunger that changes the body, hunger that weakens the legs, hunger that makes thought difficult, hunger that turns every smell of food into torment, hunger that makes a person dream about bread. Enoch knew what the text had said. There had been people on earth who possessed enough to provide sustenance. They could have fed the hungry. They could have preserved life, but they refused. And the refusal was not accidental. They had chosen their possessions over another person's survival. Enoch looked at the prisoner. Then he looked beyond the cell. He saw another, and another, and another. The terrible realization settled over him. This was not one victim. It was a multitude. People had died because others had decided that their hunger was less important than their own abundance. And Enoch suddenly remembered the world he had left behind. The markets, the storehouses, the wealthy households, the granaries, the merchants, the rulers, the powerful. He remembered how easily abundance could become invisible to the person who possessed it. A person who has eaten every day may forget what hunger feels like. A person who sleeps beneath a roof may forget the terror of exposure. A person surrounded by clothing may never imagine what it means to have nothing to cover the body. A person with servants may forget what it means to be powerless. And the ancient vision was forcing Enoch to remember. The weak could not simply be treated as an inconvenience. They were human. Their hunger was real. Their nakedness was real. Their fear was real. Their suffering was known. And if someone possessed the ability to relieve that suffering but instead chose to profit from it, the act was not morally neutral. It was a choice. Enoch moved deeper into the prison. Then he saw something that made him stop. A garment. It lay on the ground. Nothing remarkable. Simple cloth. But Enoch stared at it. The guides had spoken about those who took away the last garment of the naked. Now the image seemed almost unbearable. A garment can appear insignificant to someone who owns many, but to a person exposed to freezing wind, one garment can mean survival. To a poor family, one blanket can mean the difference between life and death. To a child, one piece of clothing can be protection from the elements. The ancient vision understood this. It did not speak about clothing as luxury. It spoke about the last garment, the final covering, the thing remaining after everything else had been taken. And some people had taken even that. Enoch looked at the garment again. He imagined the person from whom it had been stripped. Someone had possessed more than enough. Someone else had possessed almost nothing. And the person with abundance had reached down and taken the last protection from the one who needed it most. Why? Profit, power, cruelty, indifference. The reason almost did not matter. The act itself revealed something about the heart. Enoch looked toward the frozen darkness. Now he understood why the prison contained both fire and ice. The imagery was not merely meant to terrify. It exposed a moral contradiction. Human beings had been given the ability to make the world more livable for one another. Instead, some had made it colder. They had taken warmth away. They had taken food away. They had taken possessions away. They had taken dignity away. And now they entered a realm where warmth and comfort were no longer guaranteed. Enoch whispered, "Why would a person do this?" His guide answered, "Because he loved what he possessed more than the life of the one who stood before him." The words struck Enoch. More than the life. That was the issue. The prison was revealing misplaced love. A person could love money more than mercy, possessions more than people, power more than justice, pride more than truth, desire more than obedience. And once the order was reversed, cruelty became possible. Enoch thought about the first theft. Perhaps it seemed small. Perhaps the thief told himself, "It is only one thing." Then another. Then another. The appetite grows. The conscience becomes quieter. Soon the person no longer sees possessions belonging to others. He sees opportunities. The poor man's house becomes an opportunity. The widow's property becomes an opportunity. The desperate person's labor becomes an opportunity. The hungry person's need becomes an opportunity. The naked person's vulnerability becomes an opportunity. And the human being disappears behind the transaction. That was the horror. The victim ceased to be a person. He became something to be used. Enoch's guides continued walking. The prison opened into a larger chamber. Here there were no individual cells, only darkness and people. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. Enoch could not count. Some were crying, some were silent. Some seemed to wander without knowing where they were going. Others sat against the walls. There was no community here, no comfort, no friendship, no mutual protection. Each person seemed trapped within his own consequence. Enoch looked at them. He realized something terrible. On earth, many of these people had been surrounded by others, families, servants, employees, associates, followers, people who obeyed them, people who depended on them, people who feared them, but now none of those relationships mattered. The person who had commanded others could not command the angels. The person who had controlled money could not purchase freedom. The person who had used influence could not call upon it. The person who had threatened others could not threaten judgment. Earthly power had ended. Only the truth remained. And Enoch realized that the prison was an inversion of earthly society. On earth, the strong may dominate. Here, everyone was powerless. On earth, wealth can create comfort. Here, wealth was useless. On earth, a reputation can open doors. Here, no reputation mattered. On earth, people can hide their crimes. Here, there was nowhere to hide. The poor man who had been forgotten was remembered. The victim who had been silenced was remembered. The hungry person who had died unseen was remembered. The person whose final garment had been stolen was remembered. Enoch suddenly felt a strange kind of hope inside the terror. Because if the victims were remembered, then perhaps the universe was not indifferent. Perhaps every human life mattered. Perhaps no act of cruelty disappeared simply because the victim had no power to protest. Perhaps the Creator had seen what human courts could not see. Enoch looked at the fire again. For the first time, the fire seemed less like chaos. It was judgment. And judgment required memory. Someone had to remember what happened. Someone had to see. Someone had to know. The prison was terrifying because it declared that suffering had not been forgotten. But then another thought struck Enoch. If the Creator remembered the suffering of the victims, then the oppressors could not claim ignorance. They could not say, "I did not know." The vision had already told him they knew enough to choose. They possessed enough to help, and they deliberately chose otherwise. That was why the guide had emphasized their ability to provide sustenance. They could have fed. In that single word transformed the story. Could, ability, opportunity, responsibility. Enoch understood that possession itself was not automatically condemned. A person could have food. A person could have clothing. A person could have wealth. A person could have influence. The question was what the person did with those things. Did he use abundance to preserve life? Or did he use abundance to increase his own power while others died? Did he treat possessions as gifts or as weapons? Did he recognize the hungry? Or did he look away? Did he protect the vulnerable? Or did he exploit them? The ancient vision was asking questions that wealth alone could never answer. Enoch walked onward. He saw a man who had once been known for his generosity. At least, that was what people had believed. The man had given gifts publicly. He had sponsored celebrations. He had made offerings. He had been praised. But the guide revealed something else. Behind the public generosity was private exploitation. The man gave a little while taking much. He gave enough to create an image of kindness. Then he took advantage of those who could not resist. Enoch stared. The contradiction was disturbing. Could a person perform generosity while remaining cruel? Could someone give with one hand while stealing with the other? Could a person appear righteous while feeding upon the vulnerable? The prison answered, yes. Human beings can construct appearances, but appearances do not survive judgment. Enoch remembered the idols, images made by human hands, and he realized that people could construct another kind of idol, an image of themselves, a reputation, a public identity, a carefully crafted appearance. The idol says, "This is who I am," but the Creator sees what lies behind it. The public image cannot protect the private heart. And Enoch understood that the prison was filled not only with people who had done evil, but with people who had become skilled at hiding evil. The guides took him farther. He saw merchants, rulers, household masters, landowners, people who had once controlled resources. The vision did not condemn them merely because they had possessed authority. It condemned the misuse of authority. A ruler can defend or exploit. A merchant can provide or defraud. A landowner can protect or dispossess. A wealthy person can feed or starve. A powerful person can lift or crush. Strength itself is not the crime. The question is what strength becomes when placed in human hands. Enoch understood. Strength without mercy becomes oppression. Wealth without compassion becomes exploitation. Knowledge without wisdom becomes manipulation. Authority without justice becomes tyranny. Freedom without restraint becomes destruction. And religion without truth becomes hypocrisy. The prison was revealing the end of each. Then Enoch heard a sound. A cry. He turned. A man was calling for someone. Perhaps a family member. Perhaps someone who had died. Perhaps someone he had once betrayed. The voice echoed. No answer. Enoch looked at his guides. They said nothing. The man cried again. Still nothing. Enoch felt sorrow. The prison had no comfort. But perhaps that was part of the judgment. On earth, the man had been able to ignore the cries of others. Here, his own cry could not force the universe to respond according to his desire. Enoch thought of the phrase, seizing the poor by the throat. It was a brutal image. And the throat is where breath passes. To seize someone there is to threaten life itself. The strong person does not merely take an object. He takes control over another person's ability to survive. That was the deepest form of exploitation. A person who owns the food can control the hungry. A person who owns the land can control the homeless. A person who controls employment can control the desperate. A person who controls information can manipulate the ignorant. A person who controls force can intimidate the weak. Power becomes most dangerous when the victim has no alternative. Enoch saw that now. The sin of the strong against the weak was not merely that one person had more than another. It was the deliberate use of unequal power to destroy another person's ability to live with dignity. The prison was therefore not simply a place of personal punishment. It carried a social warning. A civilization could become corrupt without every individual becoming a murderer. It could happen through thousands of smaller acts. A merchant cheats. A ruler confiscates. A powerful person lies. A landlord exploits. A wealthy man refuses food. A person takes the last garment. A neighbor looks away. A community grows accustomed to suffering. Eventually, cruelty becomes normal. And when cruelty becomes normal, people stop recognizing it as cruelty. That frightened Enoch, because evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it becomes ordinary. A man steals. His neighbor laughs. A rich person exploits. His friends call him successful. A ruler crushes the poor. His court calls him strong. A person hoards food while others starve. His household calls him prudent. The language changes. The crime remains. The prison exposes the difference. Enoch's guide looked at him. Do you understand? Enoch nodded. But the guide continued. The one who takes from another does not merely steal an object. Enoch listened. He steals what that object means. Enoch looked puzzled. The guide pointed toward the darkness. Food is not merely food to the starving. Enoch understood. Food means life. Clothing is not merely cloth to the naked. It means protection. A home is not merely walls to the homeless. It means shelter. Possession is not merely property to the poor. It may represent security, dignity, the ability to survive tomorrow. Enoch's eyes filled with sorrow. The exploitation of the poor was therefore more serious than taking material objects. The oppressor could steal the future. That was why the passage spoke of stealing the souls of men. The soul was not being stolen like a physical object. The language suggested something deeper. A person can be crushed until hope disappears. A person can be exploited until identity disappears. A person can be humiliated until dignity disappears. A person can be starved until strength disappears. A person can be treated as property until the person begins to believe he is nothing more than property. That was the theft. The oppressor takes something invisible, something priceless, something that cannot easily be restored. Enoch looked across the prison. Now he saw the human cost behind the ancient list. Stealing was not merely about possessions. Lying was not merely about words. Insulting was not merely about speech. Coveting was not merely about desire. Resentment was not merely about emotion. Murder was not merely about death. Each could become a weapon against another human being, and the strongest weapon was often the one that convinced the victim that nobody cared. Enoch looked toward the northern darkness. He wondered whether the prison was designed to make the condemned experience the absence of everything they had denied others. The merciless person entered a merciless place. The exploiter entered a place where his power was useless. The thief lost everything. The idolater discovered silence. The liar encountered truth. The violent person encountered judgment. The person who withheld sustenance encountered hunger. The person who stripped the naked encountered exposure. The reversal was complete. And yet Enoch could not escape one troubling question. Why show this to him? Why allow a mortal man to witness such things? Why expose him to images that could remain in his memory forever? Then he remembered the world of the living. That was the answer. The vision was a warning, a terrifying warning. But a warning is not the same thing as a sentence. The person who is warned still has time. The person who hears the warning can turn. The person who sees the road ahead can choose another path. Enoch understood that his journey through the northern prison was therefore an act of mercy. The horror had a purpose. He was being shown the end so that he could speak about the beginning, the judgment so that he could warn about the choices, the prison so that he could warn about the road. And perhaps that was why the guides had emphasized the vulnerable, the hungry, the naked, the poor. Those were the people most easily ignored, the people least able to repay generosity, the people with the least political power, the people whose suffering could be hidden, the people who could disappear without making the powerful uncomfortable. But heaven had not forgotten them. Enoch looked at the darkness, and suddenly the prison seemed to contain an accusation against every society that says, some lives matter less. The vision rejected that idea. The poor person matters. The hungry person matters. The naked person matters. The victim matters. The stranger matters. The person without influence matters. The person whose voice is weak matters. The Creator sees them, and because the Creator sees them, the strong cannot pretend that their suffering is invisible. Enoch walked onward. The fire continued. The ice remained. The angels moved. But now he was thinking about something else. Mercy. What would happen if the powerful chose mercy instead? What if the person with food fed the hungry? What if the person with clothing covered the naked? What if the wealthy protected rather than exploited? What if the powerful defended rather than crushed? What if the thief returned what he had stolen? What if the liar confessed? What if the violent stopped? What if the idolater turned again toward the Creator? What if the person who had become proud of evil finally felt shame? Enoch realized that the vision was terrifying precisely because those choices were possible. The condemned had not been incapable of choosing differently. They had chosen again and again. The prison was the culmination, and Enoch suddenly saw the most frightening thing of all. The road to judgment could begin with something so small that nobody else noticed. A decision, a thought, a refusal. A moment when someone weaker stood before a stronger person. The stronger person could help. Instead, he took That moment mattered. Then another came, and another. Soon, exploitation became habit. Habit became character. Character became identity. And eventually, the person no longer thought of himself as someone choosing evil. He simply thought, this is how the world works. That sentence echoed in Enoch's mind. This is how the world works. Perhaps that was one of the great lies of corruption. The belief that cruelty is normal, that the strong must always consume the weak, that the rich must always exploit the poor, that the hungry must remain hungry, that the naked must remain naked, that those without power do not deserve protection. The northern prison rejected that lie. The world does not belong to the strongest. The poor are not invisible. The hungry are not disposable. The naked are not without dignity. The victim is not forgotten. And the powerful are not beyond accountability. Enoch stood before the river of fire. It moved endlessly through the darkness. He wondered where it came from. He could not see its source. He could not see its destination, but it flowed like time, like consequence, like judgment. And Enoch realized that human beings often think consequences arrive suddenly, but perhaps they flow toward us long before we notice. One decision, then another, then another. The river is already moving. Enoch looked toward the place from which he had entered. For a moment, he imagined the sunlight. He imagined ordinary people, people who still had time, people who could still choose mercy. And he wanted to return, but before he could leave, the guides showed him something else. A group of people stood together in the darkness. They had once been powerful. Now they were indistinguishable. No crowns, no gold, no servants, no titles, no wealth, only human beings. Enoch understood. Death had stripped away the artificial differences. The prison had revealed the truth that earthly society often hides. Underneath wealth and poverty, rank and obscurity, influence and weakness, every person remains a creature before the Creator. The powerful person is not more human than the poor. The wealthy person is not more valuable than the hungry. The ruler is not more sacred than the servant. The person with many possessions does not possess a greater soul. And when the earthly distinctions disappear, the moral question becomes brutally simple. What did you do with the power you were given? Enoch heard the question as though it were spoken directly to him. What did you do? What did you do when someone needed help? What did you do when you had enough? What did you do when you could have protected someone? What did you do when you had the opportunity to tell the truth? What did you do when nobody was watching? What did you do with the strength you possessed? Enoch's heart trembled, because suddenly the vision was no longer about them. It was about everyone, even him. The prison had ceased to be merely a destination for the wicked. It had become a mirror, and every living person could look into it. Not to admire the punishment, not to celebrate the suffering of the condemned, but to ask whether the road they were walking was leading toward darkness. Enoch looked at the angels one final time. They remained at their appointed stations. The instruments were ready. The chains remained. The fire continued burning. The ice continued freezing. The prison remained. But Enoch now understood something that he had not understood when he first entered. The most merciless thing in the prison was not the angel. It was the absence of opportunity. The living can still change. The dead cannot. The living can return what they stole. The dead cannot. The living can feed someone. The dead cannot. The living can clothe someone. The dead cannot. The living can confess. The dead cannot. The living can forgive. The dead cannot. The living can turn. toward the Creator. The dead can no longer rewrite the choices of earthly life. That was why Enoch had been shown the prison. He was alive. And the people who would hear his testimony could still choose. The northern region was therefore a warning aimed backward toward the world of the living. A warning to the strong. A warning to the wealthy. A warning to rulers. A warning to merchants. A warning to households. A warning to anyone who possesses more than another person. Power is not proof of superiority. Wealth is not proof of divine favor. Strength is not permission to dominate. Possession is not permission to exploit. And abundance creates responsibility. Enoch turned away from the prison. He had come to see the punishment. He had learned the crime. But now he understood the deeper lesson. The opposite of oppression is not merely poverty. The opposite of oppression is mercy joined to justice. The opposite of greed is not simply giving away everything. It is recognizing that another person's life has value beyond what that person can offer you. The opposite of cruelty is not weakness. It is strength disciplined by compassion. And the opposite of idolatry is not merely refusing to bow before images. It is remembering who truly owns the life, the world, and everything human beings possess. Enoch looked once more at the poor, the hungry, the naked, the forgotten. Then he looked at the powerful, and he understood. And the Creator had placed them all beneath the same heaven. The powerful had been given an opportunity to become protectors. Some had become predators. They had been given enough to preserve life. Some had used abundance to increase their own wealth. They had been given strength. Some had used it to crush. They had been given voices. Some had used them to lie. They had been given hands. Some had used them to steal. They had been given freedom. Some had used it to destroy. The prison was the final revelation of what those choices had produced. Enoch's guides began leading him away. The darkness followed for a while. Then the sound of the angels became faint. The river of fire disappeared behind a distant wall. The ice faded. The screams became whispers. And Enoch walked. He did not speak. He could not. The images were too heavy. He had seen the place prepared for those who refused to glorify the Creator. But now he understood that the warning was not simply, do not go there. It was, do not become the kind of person who belongs there. And that was a far more frightening warning, because a destination can be avoided by changing direction. But direction must change before the journey ends. Enoch was still walking when he realized that something had changed in the darkness ahead. There was light, very faint, almost invisible, but real. Enoch stopped. He looked toward it. For the first time since entering the northern region, he could see something that resembled hope, light. He had not forgotten light existed, but after so long in darkness, even the smallest glow seemed miraculous. Enoch turned toward his guides. They were already moving. He followed, but before he crossed fully away from the prison, he looked back. The black fire still burned. The frozen darkness still waited. The angels still guarded the detention places. The judgment had not disappeared, but Enoch was leaving. And now he knew what he would tell the living. He would tell them about the fire. He would tell them about the ice. He would tell them about the angels. But above all, he would tell them about the hungry, the naked, the poor, the powerless, because those were the people the strong could most easily forget, and heaven had not forgotten them. Enoch walked toward the light. Behind him, the prison remained. Ahead of him waited the world of the living. And between those two worlds stood the greatest gift a mortal could possess. Not wealth, not strength, not knowledge, not power. Time. Time to choose. Time to turn. Time to help. Time to repent. Time to become merciful before mercy was no longer an option. Enoch continued walking. But the question remained behind him, burning more fiercely than the river of fire. When you possess the power to save someone from suffering, what will you do with it? And somewhere in the darkness, the prison waited for the answer. Enoch had seen the place. Now he had to leave it. But leaving was not the same as escaping. The darkness had entered his memory. The black fire still burned somewhere behind him. The river of flames still moved through that terrible land. The freezing darkness still surrounded the detention places, and the angels remained at their appointed stations, their instruments of judgment ready in their hands. Enoch was being taken away. But he knew he would never truly leave the place behind. He would carry it. He would carry the cries. He would carry the silence. He would carry the sight of the hungry, the naked, the exploited, the thieves, the liars, the violent, the idolaters. The people who had possessed the power to preserve life, but had chosen instead to profit from suffering. He would carry the image of angels moving through the darkness without pity. And most of all, he would carry the question that had become impossible to silence. What had these people done while they still had time? That question followed him as the guides led him away. At first, Enoch continued looking backward. He saw the darkness stretching behind him. The prison seemed endless. Its walls disappeared into blackness. The fire illuminated nothing. The ice reflected nothing. The angels seemed to belong to the place itself. And Enoch realized that he had spent so long looking at the punishment that he had almost forgotten something important. The condemned had once been alive. They had not been born inside those cells. They had not awakened one morning already chained beneath the black fire. They had once lived in the world he was returning to. They had walked beneath the sun. They had heard birds. They had felt rain. They had watched children grow. They had eaten bread. They had possessed clothing. They had owned houses and land. They had earned money. They had met strangers. They had encountered suffering. And in those ordinary moments, they had made decisions. That was where their story truly began. Not in the prison, on earth, in ordinary life. That realization changed the meaning of everything Enoch had seen. The prison was not the beginning. It was the end. The darkness was the final chapter of a story that had begun beneath daylight. Enoch walked onward. The light ahead became stronger. He could feel something changing. The air no longer seemed completely frozen. The oppressive silence began to break. Far away, perhaps beyond the boundaries of the vision, there were sounds he recognized. Wind, movement, life. Enoch stopped. For a moment, he simply listened. He had become so accustomed to the cries of the condemned that ordinary sounds seemed extraordinary. The world of the living was still there, and suddenly Enoch wanted to return more urgently than ever. Because now he understood what the prison meant. Not merely evil will be punished, but the living still have time to choose another path. That was the mercy hidden inside the terror. Enoch had seen the final destination of a road, but he had not yet reached it. He could still turn, and so could the people who would eventually hear his testimony. The guides continued. Enoch followed. Then he remembered the first thing the angels had shown him. The sinners who did not glorify the Creator. At first, Enoch had wondered why that accusation stood at the beginning of the explanation. Why was the failure to glorify God connected with stealing? Why connect idolatry with exploitation? Why connect occult practices with murder? Why place the treatment of the poor beside the rejection of the Creator? Now Enoch understood. The vision was describing a disorder of the human heart. When the Creator is forgotten, creation can become an object of exploitation. Another human being can become merely a tool. A hungry person becomes a problem. A poor person becomes an opportunity. A possession becomes more valuable than the person who needs it. Power becomes permission. Desire becomes law. The self becomes the center. And when the self becomes the center, everything else can be sacrificed to it. Enoch thought about the idols, images made by human hands. They could not see. They could not hear. They could not speak, yet people bowed before them. The irony had seemed simple when he first heard it. Now it seemed profound. A human being could make something with his hands and then surrender himself to it. He could create wealth and become enslaved to wealth, create power and become consumed by power, create status and become desperate for admiration, create possessions and spend his life protecting them, create an image of himself and become trapped inside that image. Human beings could become servants of the things they created. The idol did not need to be made of wood. It could be anything that replaced the Creator. And Enoch now saw another connection. The people who exploited the weak had also created idols. They worshipped something, perhaps money, perhaps control, perhaps pleasure, perhaps pride, perhaps the feeling of being superior. Whatever it was, they had decided that it was worth sacrificing another human being to obtain. That was idolatry in another form. The human being had become less valuable than the object of desire. Enoch continued toward the light, and then he remembered the hungry. This memory struck him hardest. The ancient passage does not merely describe people who happened to possess food while others were hungry. It speaks of those who could provide sustenance. They had the ability. They had the means. Yet they allowed the hungry to die. Enoch had stood before such people in the prison. He had seen what their decisions had become. Now he imagined them back on earth. Perhaps a hungry person had stood outside a door. Perhaps a family had come seeking grain. Perhaps a child had cried. Perhaps a widow had pleaded. And someone inside the house had looked at the stored food, then looked at the hungry, and decided, no. That one word could become a sentence. The person with abundance could choose not to share. The hungry person could grow weaker. The family could suffer. The child could die. And the person with food could continue eating. The terrible thing was that no thunder necessarily came from heaven at that moment. The earth continued. The sun rose. The markets opened. People went about their lives. The powerful person might even be praised for being successful. That was why the prison existed in the vision, because earthly appearances can deceive. A person can seem successful while carrying moral ruin. A person can become wealthy while destroying others. A person can gain power while losing the soul. The prison reveals the difference. There, no one could hide behind success. Enoch remembered the naked, the same principle. Someone had clothing, someone else had almost nothing. The powerful person could have given. Instead, he took away. Again, the world might not have stopped. No angel might have appeared in the street. No heavenly voice might have shouted. But the victim remembered. The Creator remembered. And eventually the oppressor stood before the judgment. Enoch's guides had shown him the final reversal. Now he understood it. The person who had withheld food encountered a place where comfort was gone. The person who had stripped away clothing encountered exposure. The person who had stolen possessions discovered that possessions could not save him. The person who had seized the poor by the throat discovered that he was no longer powerful. The person who had lied discovered that truth could not be manipulated. The person who had boasted discovered that there was no audience left to impress. The person who had bowed before lifeless images discovered that those images could not rescue him. The reversal was complete. Enoch looked toward the growing light. He was almost beyond the prison. Then another thought came. What if the condemned had changed? What if they had stopped? What if they had returned what they stole? What if they had fed the hungry? What if they had clothed the naked? What if they had confessed their lies? What if they had abandoned violence? What if they had turned away from forbidden practices? What if they had recognized the Creator? Enoch realized that this was precisely why he had been shown the prison. The vision was not merely describing the end. It was warning about the beginning. The terror came before the sentence. The warning came before the judgment, and warning implied possibility. A person who has been warned still possesses a choice. That was why Enoch's journey mattered. He was being shown what the living could still avoid. The vision was terrible because it was intended to make indifference impossible. Enoch had now seen what indifference became. It became fire. It became ice. It became chains. It became darkness. It became separation. It became the loss of every earthly illusion. He reached the edge of the northern region. The light was now unmistakable. Enoch looked back. The prison remained. And he suddenly noticed something he had not seen before. There was no wealth there, no golden palace, no storehouse, no throne, no magnificent estate, no treasure chamber. All the things that had driven the greed of the condemned were absent. They had spent their earthly lives pursuing things that could not cross the boundary of death. The rich had died. The wealth remained behind. The powerful had died. The authority passed to someone else. The beautiful had died. The image faded. The rulers had died. The kingdoms continued without them. The possessors had died. The possessions remained. And Enoch understood a truth that was both simple and terrifying. A person can spend an entire life accumulating what he cannot keep. The prison was filled with the consequences of what had been done to obtain those things. But the things themselves were gone. Enoch remembered the ancient warning about enriching oneself from the possessions of others. It was not simply theft. It was the pursuit of wealth through another person's loss. That kind of wealth could appear powerful, but it had no value in the prison. The person who had accumulated everything had arrived with nothing, and the person he had harmed remained part of the moral record. Enoch walked onward. Now he began to think about the word reward. The ancient passage describes the place as an eternal reward. The phrase is chilling. A reward is normally something desired, a gift, a prize, something a person seeks. But this reward was different. It was the final result of a chosen way of living. The word became an irony. They had pursued one kind of reward on earth: wealth, pleasure, power, control, forbidden knowledge, recognition. Now they received another. The consequence of their choices. Enoch understood. A person's actions eventually produce a harvest. Sometimes the harvest appears quickly. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it seems as though nothing will happen at all. But the vision insists that no moral action is meaningless. No hidden cruelty is forgotten. No act of mercy is invisible. No stolen possession disappears from the moral universe. No hungry person becomes insignificant merely because the world stops speaking about them. No victim becomes worthless because the powerful refuse to acknowledge them. Enoch looked toward the light, and the thought gave him courage. If heaven remembered the victims, then the world was not ultimately governed by the logic of the strongest. Earthly power could be unjust. Human courts could fail. Rulers could become corrupt. Wealth could manipulate. The poor could be ignored. But there remained a higher judgment, and that meant the powerful were never truly beyond accountability. Enoch finally stepped into the light. He stopped. The darkness behind him seemed almost unreal, yet he knew it had been real. He had walked through it. He had heard the sounds. He had seen the angels. He had witnessed the suffering. And now he stood where light existed again. For a moment he closed his eyes. Then he heard something, a human voice. Enoch opened his eyes. Someone was speaking. He could not yet make out the words, but the sound itself was comforting. A living voice. Not a cry from a prison. Not a desperate plea to an angel. A living voice. Enoch realized how precious ordinary human speech suddenly seemed. The living world was beautiful, even with its violence, even with its injustice, even with its corruption, because the living still possessed something the prisoners had lost. Possibility. A person could still apologize. A thief could still return. A liar could still confess. An oppressor could still release. A wealthy person could still feed. A powerful person could still protect. A violent person could still stop. An idolater could still turn. The living world was therefore not merely a place of temptation. It was a place of mercy. Every morning was another opportunity. Every encounter with a suffering person was another test. Every possession was another responsibility. Every choice was another direction. Enoch understood why the vision had frightened him so deeply. The terrifying thing was not merely that judgment existed. The terrifying thing was that people often lived as though their choices did not matter. They believed they could do anything and escape consequences. They believed wealth could protect them. They believed secrecy could protect them. They believed status could protect them. They believed death would erase the record. But Enoch had seen otherwise. The universe remembered. The Creator remembered. The victims mattered. And the human heart mattered. Enoch looked at his hands. They were empty. He had no wealth, no treasure, no army, no throne. But he possessed something greater. A message. And now he understood the burden of carrying it. He had to tell the living what he had seen. Not to satisfy curiosity. Not to create spectacle. Not simply to frighten people with descriptions of fire. He had to tell them because the vision contained a moral warning. A person can become dangerous when strength is not controlled by compassion. A ruler can become a predator. A wealthy person can become an exploiter. A merchant can become a deceiver. A religious person can become a hypocrite. A seeker of knowledge can become obsessed with forbidden power. A person can create an idol and then become enslaved to it. And any human being can become so accustomed to selfishness that the suffering of another no longer touches the heart. That was the real darkness. Enoch had seen physical darkness, but now he understood spiritual darkness. It is possible to have eyes and refuse to see, ears and refuse to hear, food and refuse to feed, clothing and refuse to cover, strength and refuse to protect, wealth and refuse to share, knowledge and refuse to speak truth, power and refuse to act justly. That was the darkness the prison represented. And perhaps that was why the ancient texts placed such emphasis on idols that could neither see nor hear. The idol has eyes, but cannot see. The human being has eyes and can see. The idol has ears, but cannot hear. The human being has ears and can hear. The idol cannot respond to suffering. The human being can. The Creator had made human beings capable of compassion. To refuse compassion was therefore to become less than what one was created to be. Enoch looked back toward the prison. The black flames seemed smaller now, but they still burned. He knew the warning would not be complete without one final truth. The vision was not teaching that every hardship is a punishment. It was not saying that every poor person is guilty or that every wealthy person is condemned. The emphasis was on deliberate wrongdoing. The people shown to Enoch had the ability to help, but chose to exploit. They stole, they lied, they murdered, they deceived, they practiced forbidden arts, they worshipped false gods, they boasted about evil, they enriched themselves through the suffering of others. The issue was not merely what they had, it was what they chose. That distinction mattered. Because mercy does not require poverty. Justice does not require weakness. A person can possess wealth and still be compassionate. A ruler can possess authority and still be just. A merchant can become prosperous without defrauding. A strong person can use strength to protect. The question was always, what do you do with what you have been given? Enoch carried that question with him. It would become the central message of the vision. Not fear wealth, but do not worship wealth. Not fear power, but do not use power to crush. Not fear possessions, but do not value possessions above human life. Not fear knowledge, but do not seek forbidden power while rejecting wisdom. Not fear the poor, but remember them. Not fear judgment, but let the warning change the way you live before judgment comes. Enoch continued walking. The light grew brighter. The darkness behind him became distant, but then he heard something, a cry. Enoch stopped. He turned. The sound had not come from the prison. It had come from the world of the living. A person was crying, a human being in pain. Enoch listened. For a moment, he simply stood. Then he realized what the vision had taught him. This was the moment. Not the prison, not the angels, not the fire, not the ice. This moment, a suffering person standing before someone who had the power to respond. The question was not, what will happen after death? The question was, what will you do now? Enoch felt the full weight of the vision. The living person could choose, feed, or ignore, cover, or strip away, protect, or exploit, tell the truth, or lie, forgive, or destroy, give, or steal, acknowledge the Creator, or worship the things made by human hands. The choice was still alive. Enoch turned toward the sound and walked. He was no longer merely the man who had seen a terrifying prison. He was now a witness. A man carrying a warning from beyond the boundaries of ordinary life. He would tell people that darkness exists, but he would also tell them that light exists. He would tell them about judgment, but he would also tell them about the opportunity to change. He would tell them about the angels who showed no pity, but he would also remind the living that mercy was still available to them. He would tell them about the black fire, but he would tell them that they were not yet inside it. He would tell them about the freezing darkness, but he would remind them that they could still choose warmth. He would tell them about the prison, but he would tell them that they still possessed freedom. And perhaps this was the deepest mercy hidden inside the most terrifying vision. Enoch was shown the end before he reached it. The living can still turn around. The thief can still return what was stolen. The liar can still speak truth. The cruel can still become merciful. The wealthy can still feed. The powerful can still protect. The naked can still be clothed. The oppressed can still be defended. The idolater can still turn away from lifeless things. The person who has wandered into darkness can still walk toward the light. That was the message Enoch carried. Not merely, hell exists, but do not let your heart become the kind of place where hell begins. Because perhaps the most terrifying journey does not begin after death. Perhaps it begins while a person is still alive. It begins when the suffering of another person stops mattering. It begins when greed becomes more important than compassion. It begins when power becomes more important than justice. It begins when possessions become more valuable than people. It begins when lies become easier than truth. It begins when cruelty becomes ordinary. It begins when the Creator is forgotten. And if that road continues long enough, a person can arrive at a place where he no longer recognizes what he has become. Enoch had seen the final destination. Now he had to warn the living about the first step. He walked into the light, and the northern prison disappeared behind him. But its question remained. It would remain in the minds of those who heard the story. It would remain wherever the strong encountered the weak, wherever the wealthy encountered the hungry, wherever someone possessed more than enough while another possessed almost nothing, wherever power could be used either to protect or exploit, wherever a person had the opportunity to show mercy. The question would stand, not spoken by the angels, not written across the walls, not carved into stone, but planted inside the conscience. What will you do with what you have been given? Enoch knew the answer could change everything. A person could use strength to save, wealth to feed, clothing to cover, power to defend, knowledge to illuminate, words to tell the truth, hands to give, and a heart to recognize the Creator. Or a person could choose the opposite. The prison had shown him where that road ends. Now he knew where the other road could lead. Toward light, toward mercy, toward justice, toward life. Enoch walked farther. The sun rose. The world continued. People woke. Children cried. Families prepared food. Merchants opened their stalls. Rulers issued commands. The rich counted possessions. The poor searched for work. The hungry searched for bread. The naked searched for clothing. The powerful looked for opportunities. And everywhere, choices were being made. Small choices. Quiet choices. Choices nobody thought heaven was watching. But Enoch knew better. He had seen the record. He had seen the prison. He had seen what hidden choices could become. And so the vision ended where the warning truly began. Not in the northern darkness, not beside the river of fire, not among the merciless angels, but in the ordinary world beneath the sun, because the terrifying place Enoch had been shown was waiting at the end of a road, and the road was made of decisions. Every act of mercy could turn someone away from darkness. Every act of cruelty could lead deeper into it. Every opportunity to feed the hungry could become a testimony. Every refusal could become another step. Every choice mattered. Enoch looked toward the horizon. The light was overwhelming now. He could barely see the darkness behind him, but he remembered it. He would always remember it. The fire, the ice, the chains, the angels, the cries, the hungry, the naked, the exploited, the people who had worshipped things that could neither see nor hear. And he remembered the terrible phrase with which the vision described that place, an eternal reward. Not because the condemned had sought darkness by name, but because they had spent their lives choosing the things that ultimately produced it. Enoch understood. The prison was not simply the end of a life. It was The final revelation of a life. What a person loved. What a person worshipped. What a person did with power. What a person did with wealth. What a person did when nobody was watching. How a person treated those who could offer nothing in return. Whether a person saw another human being as a burden or as a fellow creature of the Creator. The northern prison had answered those questions, and now Enoch carried the answers back. He had entered the darkness as a frightened man. He returned as a witness. He had entered asking, "Why is this place so terrible?" He returned understanding, because the choices that lead there are terrible. He had entered looking at punishment. He returned looking at mercy. And perhaps that was the true purpose of the vision, not to glorify fear, not to make suffering entertaining, but to make the living understand that they still possess something precious. A choice, a chance, a tomorrow. Enoch walked beneath the rising light. Behind him, the prison remained. Ahead of him was the world. And somewhere in that world, someone was hungry. Someone was naked. Someone was being cheated. Someone was being exploited. Someone was being lied to. Someone was powerless before someone stronger. And Enoch knew exactly what the vision demanded. Do not look away. Because the moment the strong sees the weak and chooses mercy, the road changes. The moment the wealthy sees the hungry and chooses to feed, the road changes. The moment the powerful sees the vulnerable and chooses to protect, the road changes. The moment the liar chooses truth, the road changes. The moment the thief chooses restitution, the road changes. The moment the violent chooses restraint, the road changes. The moment the idolater turns away from lifeless things and remembers the Creator, the road changes. The prison may still exist, the fire may still burn, the angels may still stand, but the living are not yet there. They still have time, and that was the message Enoch carried out of the darkness. You are not yet where you are going. You can still turn. You can still choose. You can still show mercy. And Enoch walked into the light. The vision was over, but the warning had only begun.